Welcome, everyone. I'm Patricia Cranz, Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club of America. We are delighted tonight to have a new installment in our How I Did It series with Renata Brito and Felipe Dana of the Associated Press, who won the OPC's Kim Wall Award this year for their series Adrift. Talking to them tonight will be their editor, Mary Rajkumar, Global Investigations Editor of the AP and an OPC governor. Mary has led two other international investigations for AP that won the Pulitzer Prize and also OPC awards for Erasing Mariupol and Seafood for Slaves. Her AP information says she edited stories that won 10 OPC awards overall, not including Adrift. Well done, Mary. So the panel will talk for about 30 minutes and then open it for questions. Feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time. And this program is being recorded and we will post it on our YouTube channel. So I now hand it over to Mary.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening. So let me start with the disclosure, which is I was an editor on this project, not the editor. The editor was Ted Anthony, and he should get credit. So credit to Ted. So I have the pleasure of introducing Felipe and Renata, two of our favorite people at the AP. Renata just won a Livingston Award this year, and Adrift has won a series of other awards, including a Webby, and as Patty noted, an OPC award and a World Press Photo Award. And Felipe was part of the team that won a 2023 Pulitzer Prize for the breaking news photography in Ukraine. He was also a Pulitzer finalist in 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2021. So I should mention that they are married. They are obviously a power couple. And the subhead of this session will be how I did it without killing my spouse. So so let's dive straight into it. How did you two get interested in this story? How did you find out about it? Why did you think there was more to it? Can you jump into it?
Yes, thanks, Mary, for the introduction, and Patricia, and thanks for having us to talk about Adrift. So it really started with a phone call from one of my sources who noticed this local news story out of Trinidad and Tobago of a boat that appeared, a strange boat that appeared full of dead bodies. And I cover migration and I'm based in Spain. And so my source as well is a migration expert. We both looked at this boat and we immediately recognized it as the same type of boat that migrants use to migrate from West Africa to Spain, specifically from Mauritania to Spain. So when we saw this boat in Tobago on this local news story, we were both shocked, as were other people who had noticed this news, because it meant that it was likely that migrants had gotten lost in the Atlantic, as we knew that, it happens so often, but we hadn't seen, or at least, there was very little precedent for boats drifting all the way across the Atlantic, even though there were no survivors. And so it just immediately shocked me, and it made me wonder, if this boat drifted across the Atlantic, how many others are lost or sank or are missing? And I think it just rang alarm bells in my head that we need to look into this.
And Renata, you were saying that a source of yours had previously predicted really that there was going to be more traffic on the more dangerous Atlantic route because of closures on the Mediterranean. So one of the things that I think we really wanted to emphasize in the story, it isn't just a story about this one boat. It's a story of accountability, about the EU's policies and what has led to hundreds of people anonymously dying. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. So obviously, the reasons why people migrate and the reasons why certain routes see more traffic is complex, and there's multiple reasons. But one of them was heightened surveillance in the Mediterranean that led people to look into alternatives and smugglers to look into alternatives. And this Atlantic route, we call it the Atlantic route from West Africa to the Canary Islands, which is a European Union territory near the west coast of Africa, reopened, let's say, in 2020, 2021 specifically. And we saw a huge increase in people taking this much more dangerous sea route to Europe. And one of the reasons was because it was getting so much harder to cross the Mediterranean. And yes, as you noticed, as you pointed out, another source of mine had warned that, these heightened surveillance border closures usually lead to people taking more dangerous
routes.
Just finding another way, basically.
To do. So just because I'm a stickler for detail, how did you know that where the boats came from? Was it their color? Was it their shape? I mean, like how do you tell something like that?
Yeah, I think once you cover, migration, especially in this region, each country has a very specific type of boat that they use, and they're very unique and colorful in different ways. So it's very easy to identify the ones from Mauritania, for example, as they are white outside and blue inside. The ones from Senegal, they are more colorful with, very specific as well. And the ones from Morocco, they also have a different shape. So you kind of know if you cover migration in Spain, the arrivals in Spain, especially in the Canary Islands, you kind of can identify where they came from because of the boats being used. And specifically the ones from Mauritania, they're very, very typical and unique to the region. So it was quite easy.
That's how you could tell.
That out.
Yeah. So as I know very well, this was a project full of challenges. So can you name some of them and tell us how you got past them? I mean, my quick list just in my head is the fact that it spanned several countries and several languages. The fact that the bureaucracy involved here was such that no officials had actually tried to do this. The fact that you did this in the middle of the 2021 pandemic. Do you guys want to talk a little bit about the challenges?
Right. I think first, the biggest challenges was just a lack of information that there is on this migration route in the Atlantic from the west coast of Africa to the Canary Islands. There is very little information. So, there's very little statistics, very little reports. Monitoring. So you really, really have to find people on the ground, local communities that are willing to talk to you. And even then, they might not have that much information. It's very opaque. So that was the first challenge. And also, as you noticed, the boat was found in Tobago. The people came from Mauritania and Mali. They were trying to get to Spain. That just a lot of very long distances, geography, and especially in the beginning when we weren't able to travel there, it was very challenging. And then once we were able to go there, we found other challenges on the field. And I can let Felipe talk about Mauritania, his favorite place to report.
Mauritania, yeah. Well, as Renata just said, it's just difficult just because the amount of countries and really continents involved in one story. And Mauritania specifically is a very challenging place to work. And we really had to investigate a lot in Mauritania, and that was extremely challenging. We had every issue they can imagine to report on the ground there. So that was also...
Yeah, they don't like to talk about migration. Migration is not something you should be asking about. Cameras are, in theory, it's a democracy and it's open to the press. In practice, it's not. And you have police checkpoints everywhere and people don't want you asking questions.
Yeah, they're really not open to journalists doing any stories that is not in their interest. And migration is one of them. Every official response that we got from them is that they don't have this issue and there are no...
When we didn't get responses.
If we got, actually, those were after we published even for other Yeah, so basically they don't
Didn't get.
acknowledge any
So what
issue.
Felipe is diplomatically avoiding saying is that the two of them, wasn't it in Mauritania that you were thrown into police custody?
No,
And
that
for-
was actually in Cape Verde. That was another.
oh, well, there we go.
That was the
And,
second part of the
We
story.
managed to avoid police in Mauritania. We were,
Well,
being
well,
very discreet.
well, not really avoid, barely, but we made it to escape
One-
prison in Mauritania. But
one thing I love about that is that you had very different approaches in terms of what was the best way to get out of prison in Cape Verde. So
yeah,
do you want to talk a little bit
We
about
weren't
that?
in prison. We were at the police station,
We're
just to be
detained.
fair. We were asked to follow police officers because we were reporting and trying to talk to survivors. And anyways, long story short, we ended up in a police station. Felipe was very agitated in explaining the, rights of journalists.
The illegality of
The
what they were
illegalities of
doing.
trying to take our cameras away
Yeah.
while I was calling the ambassadors of our respective countries to see if they could help us. And we still argue about which tactic worked best. But in the end, we managed to be released and continue our reporting.
Yeah, but that was, as Renata said, that was
That was in Cape Verde.
in the second part of Adrift
Yeah,
and 36 days.
Yeah.
But during Adrift in Mauritania, we had challenges with just everything you can imagine. Access, the fixers, the translators, the drivers were afraid when they realized we were reporting on migration. They didn't really want to work with us. So it was really difficult to work. And also culturally, at the beginning, we had issues with access in the villages. Once they figured out what we were doing and the story came out, it was the opposite. They wanted more, but it was really challenging in the beginning to really convince that we were just trying to
to explain what
Yeah.
we were doing, what we were trying to find out, and when people understood that actually, we want to find out who the victims are in this tragedy and find their families, most people were helpful, let's say.
yeah.
That's actually one thing that I would love to go into a bit more, because I think one of the hardest parts of this project was actually talking to families, since in most cases, you were the first people to give them any clue about what had happened to their loved ones, or even the fact that their loved ones were on this boat. That's really difficult news to break to anyone when you're the person doing it. And I know that you two spent a lot of time figuring out how to handle it and deciding that it was most important to be a human being first rather than a journalist.
Yeah, I think
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, we were saying about other things, but this is probably the most challenging part of the entire project. And we debated a lot about this, how to approach.
Yeah, because we were in this odd situation, as you said, where we had more information to share with families, because authorities and others who should have done this work had not done this work, they had no information from anyone about what
We're
had
the only
happened.
ones with any information,
So
actually. Yeah.
we are bringing this really tragic news while also reporting on this story. And so we really wanted to separate both on the one side, approaching families, explaining to them what we knew, and then giving them time and space to process that information and seeing later if they're still willing to talk to us for the story.
Yeah.
Because obviously, we're basically telling them that their children likely died on this boat.
Yeah. Yeah, because basically what was happening in Mauritania was we were meeting the families for the first time. And as Renata said, we were telling them, your
What happened?
Yeah.
Well, talk a little bit more. One thing you two have said is because of that, the first time you met the families, you didn't record anything and you didn't report anything, even if it meant missing that first reaction. Can you talk a little bit more? Why did you make that decision? Did you feel like you lost anything by making that decision? Talk a little bit more about that.
I think we just didn't feel comfortable to just arrive and immediately start recording and photographing and reporting before giving them a chance to process the information. And so that it didn't feel like we were also pressuring them to participate in our reporting, because we had this news that was so important for them. Although heartbreaking, it is important news because families want to know what happened, even if it's the death of their loved ones. They'd rather know than not know. And so we did miss.
Yeah, I think what we have to understand is in many of those places, we're going to remote villages where there was no phone reception, sometimes no electricity, really very little resources. And we're meeting all these family members that usually were gathering around us for the first time. And we realized that it did not feel right to start recording that encounter, as they were just at first curious and interested in understanding what we were going to tell them about their missing relatives, and then record the moment that we're telling them. It's by all the evidence that we gathered, it's very likely that
The person.
the
So
person
what
is
did you
dead.
do?
So,
Did you tell them that you'd like to come back and talk about it tomorrow? Did you invite, was that what you did? Okay.
we both discussed this a lot, and then we agreed that let's separate into
That's
parts.
what you would do.
We're gonna meet everyone first, because there were various situations like I just described. We agreed that we're gonna meet them first. We're gonna tell them what we're doing, the information that we have, and then whoever agrees to participate,
you would interview.
then we would go back.
Yeah.
And
Well,
an interview.
Right, because remember, we're also, initially we didn't have all the information, right? We have preliminary evidence that's pointing to
what might
the death, but we don't have a death certificate. We don't have a body. We don't have like 100% certain at that point. So we also have to be careful about how we deliver this news.
Yeah.
In one case, which I thought was really interesting, in a sense, you missed the first reaction because of how you decided to do it, which was the mothers, right? The mothers crying and you couldn't get that, heartbreaking as it was, you couldn't get that on camera. And then when you guys wanted to go back, it was the men who talked to you and who wouldn't let the women talk to you. Can you talk about that?
I think when we started, visiting and talking to the mothers at first, I imagined that there was a lot of pressure from the mothers on the fathers and the other men to, they were being sometimes fooled by smugglers and others who were trying to dismiss their concerns and say, no, your sons are not, have not been able to communicate because they're in prison. They're alive, but they're in prison, or they're alive, but they're, trying to deny that they were dead in this voyage. And so I think when in some cases we were asked not to talk to the women again, I think it was about the men trying to control the narrative, and also in some cases potentially trying to protect the mothers from, all the heartbreak that comes with the news. In other cases, we were welcomed back, and people wanted to talk to us and wanted to tell their stories and tell their sons.
And then, what had happened. So it was I'd love to get a little bit more into the actual investigative techniques that you guys had to use, because you really had to use a number of them. In particular, can you talk about the one survivor you got to, who told you what it was like on the boats and how you got the DNA? How did you actually trace the victims?
So there's a few things there. The survivor from another shipwreck of similar, but another boat, was very important for us to understand what the voyage was like, because there were no survivors in the boat that we were investigating, the boat that arrived in Tobago. But this young man had survived a terrible, terrible voyage that was very similar. And
Same routes.
the same routes, left Mauritania, but was by chance found by Spain. But he was only one of 3 survivors, and there were 63 people on his boat. And so he really gave us a sense of what it's like to be adrift, and what happens, and day by day, and how people start dying progressively, and how you survive or how you don't survive. So that was really important for us to understand what the people we were trying to identify and tell their stories might have gone through. So that was one important element. The other really crucial element was a list of phone numbers that authorities in Tobago had managed to extract from one of the cell phones recovered from the boat. And for various reasons, no one had actually tried calling these numbers, and they got to our hands, and we decided we should call these numbers and see, who answers, and see if they're looking for anyone that's missing.
Yeah,
And piece
these
together.
yeah, these were contact lists, so they didn't have the number of the phone, but they had basically the contact list. So what we did was Renata literally called one by one and started across the information that she could get. And then
So explaining,
Yeah.
we found your number in a phone on a boat. Do you know anyone that's disappeared? And then all these names would come up, and they would match. And so we in the end kind of had an idea of who the phone belonged to and who had traveled with that
and
person,
where they were from.
where they were from,
Yeah.
and then we went there to talk to the people that we found by calling these numbers and really putting the puzzle together. But then, of course, nothing is really certain until you actually do a DNA test on one of the deceased.
And that's when we got
yeah.
to Tobago, which so all of this was still before we got to Tobago. When we got to Tobago, we were very lucky that a police officer had still kept the evidence that they found on the boat. By some miracle, it was still there. So we basically opened every single evidence bag that was closed for almost 6 months at that time, and we photographed every item. Basically,
Clothing.
yeah,
basically.
clothing, basically clothing and phones and chargers, cataloging basically every item, and then we shared that evidence with the families to see if they could recognize some of those items. And that is how we initially found a shirt. A few shirts actually, yeah. But we could cross reference.
So then we,
yeah.
so then we said, okay, so if this shirt belongs to this person and was found on this body is likely
to be, yeah,
of that person, but only a DNA test can really confirm that. And so, it's not something journalists usually do, DNA tests. And I remember when an editor, Marjorie, suggested we do it, I thought she was, what is she talking about? But she was so right, because that was really essential to having the certainty and bringing closure to at least one family.
But basically at this point, we already had a list of possible people that board the boats, and by matching at least one DNA, we were sure that list, like that the people in our list were in fact the ones in the boat. So it was more than just one person. It was really a confirmation of
confirming the group.
The group, that boat basically belonged to that group. And so it was a lot of pieces from different
different areas. Just to clarify, so no authorities had done a DNA test before because they didn't know who to match the DNA to, right?
Yeah.
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that, because if you think about it, you have families scattered between Mali, Senegal, France, and you need like parents, you need like father, mother. It's not as simple as just, you know, anyone that's related to the person. And then you have to compare it with the DNA test of the body.
And the
So
type
all
of
this is
test
very
also
bureaucratic.
has to be the same, yeah.
Type of test. So all this is very bureaucratic and difficult to get. It's not, there's, you know, in Mali, it's not everyone that has access to a lab. It's expensive. And one of the organizations that offers this services normally is the ICRC, but even they aren't available to a lot of families, or the families struggled to get them to help at first. So then we did it through a private lab, but everything had to align for it to happen. Like this mother who was originally from Mali happened to be in Senegal, where there was a lab that we could, you know, hire and that could send a sample to Tobago. It took like months for it to get there, and chain of custody and all these things. And another few months for the authorities in Tobago to compare the DNA and you know, say whether it was a match or not. So really, really not as simple as it sounds.
But and until today, that remains the only one that was buried and
Yeah.
and
Oh,
identified.
so the others still have not been identified.
There-
Despite
Isn't that in process?
The ICRC, after our investigation, did take more samples from families on our list and sent it to authorities in Tobago. And there were matches. So I think six more bodies were identified. For some reason, they were not officially buried or identified. Families weren't given a death certificate. And again, it comes down to bureaucracy, to you know, very bureaucratic procedures, cross borders. It's not as simple as it sounds.
Talk a little bit about your source in France, Meso. How did you find her, and how did she end up being related to the boat?
It was, so Meso was an aunt who was looking for her nephew and had posted on a social media page for missing migrants. And I found her through this social media page and this activist. And she was one of the first families that I interviewed, in the sense of people looking for their loved ones in this migration route. I didn't know at the time that her nephew it would turn out that her nephew, the nephew she was looking for, was on the boat that I was investigating. But I didn't know that initially when I first reached out to her, neither did she. And by coincidence, we later figure out that her nephew had been traveling with the group from Mauritania. Her nephew from Mali had joined the group from Mauritania and had boarded the same boat. And they were the ones that we managed to send a DNA sample of his mother to the authorities in Tobago, and he was the one that we managed to identify and bury. So she was super important, super helpful throughout the entire investigation, very cooperative, very eager to find out what had happened to her nephew, and extremely helpful. And I'm very thankful for her agreeing to take part in this story. And yeah.
Yeah, and especially at the beginning, as we said, we were not sure of many things, and a lot of people were skeptical. Especially after the first DNA tests, everything changed. People realized. I think also many didn't want to accept. They wanted to know.
Yeah.
You know, it's one thing to want to know.
Yeah.
The thing is to accept. But once there was a confirmation, things changed, and everyone was actually calling Renata every day, basically asking for DNA tests and seeing if we could do more DNA tests and so on. So they want but she was really cooperative from the beginning and really trusted us. So it was really important.
So talk a little bit. One of the characteristics of this project is that you really tried to weave the text, the photos, the video in seamlessly, and that this was really part of the vision from the start. How did it change your approach? And a nod here to our digital storytelling team at the time, Raghu Vadarevu and Nat Castaneda and Linda Gorman, who were immensely helpful in working to achieve this vision. So what did that mean? How did that change how you reported?
Well, first when we realized that we were going to work on this together, we agreed that I was going to follow Renata at every step of the way, no matter how bad it sounded for photos or video. We were really going to focus on trying to gather as much visual material as possible, because now it's easy to look at the story when it's done, but if you think about the initial pitch of a story like this, it's a really difficult story to illustrate, because there are no survivors, there's no one left. At this stage, we didn't know if we are going to find any family members or anything at all to show. So it was extremely challenging, and I spoke to my photo editor at the time, which was Enrique Marti, and we kind of agreed that I'm just going to stick with Renata all the way, follow whatever she's going to try to find, and if nothing else, we'll illustrate in a very poetic way. So I had some ideas to shoot abandoned boats along the way. I even did that. I started doing that in Mauritania. But then, as we started to get more evidence and be able to follow the route that they were basically retrace. We just began to record and photograph every step of the way. And what we didn't know, but the photos really became part of the investigation and an essential part of the investigation.
Right,
So
photos of the evidence also, and video.
So the photos became an investigative technique in and of themselves, because that's what you showed people. Yeah. So it wasn't just an illustration, it was really part of the
it really became a visual investigation.
And also, I think when we said we sent back photos of the evidence to the families, we did that, but we also analyzed photos of the disappeared and found clothing on some of those photos. So we identified that they were wearing the same clothes, actually, in one of the some of the photos that the families had shared with us. They were wearing the same clothes that we found in Tobago. So in some cases, we didn't even need the families to recognize it, because it was there on the photo that they had shared with us.
Yeah, then of course, as you said, when we realized that, well, from the beginning, we were already talking to Raghu and others in the digital team, because we wanted this to be really immersive storytelling, and it's very challenging to do nice visual presentations for investigations where you don't know what you're going to get in terms of photos or video or anything. So that's why we kind of decided, let's start from the beginning and go all the way and try our best really to illustrate this in the best way. However,
the distance also, I think we wanted to have a glue that showed how vast this route was, how vast the boat had drifted away from, and how really interconnected all these continents are, because of migration, whether they want it or not. They left from West Africa, they were trying to get to Europe, they ended up in the Caribbean, and this is, the world is small in that sense.
And how all of this is linked. Did you at any point feel that you or your sources were in danger, and how did you try to protect your sources? Because the smugglers were a very real presence in this investigation. Right?
In Mauritania, we felt we didn't see or encounter, but we felt that the smugglers were kind of coming behind us, after us, and telling the families that what we were saying wasn't true, that everyone was alive, they were just in prison in Morocco because they had been intercepted by police. And then, some people that helped us, even though we asked them not to go to authorities, because we knew that in Mauritania, authorities are sometimes working with smugglers or getting bribed by smugglers. And, when people did go to the local authorities to ask for help or ask for information, they were threatened. They were asked not to ask questions. They were told off. And so,
Or they were
Yeah.
approached by the smugglers,
or approached by the smugglers and told,
told
told
not to
off,
go to
not
the
to-
authorities again.
and
So
not to talk to us,
Yeah.
or not to, help us. And that it was all nonsense. So we did feel it, and people did tell us, they were threatened, and we obviously tried to help protect them as much as we could. We were as discreet as we could. We tried to not gather too much attention, and protect our sources to a certain extent as much as we could. And
really, the focus was really identifying the victims.
Yeah, and
But-
being. Let me encourage everyone to please send in questions, to the chat, or raise questions, because I have a couple more questions for you guys, and then we can open it up to any other questions. What was the impact of this investigation when it was all, done? I mean, I think there are, I think probably the most immediate impact was on the families, but also how did it change how this is investigated? Has there been further investigation into this and other cases? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah.
Well, I think let's say the immediate impact was that we saw, for example, the ICRC that initially had said it wouldn't be able to help some families with the DNA test, then go back and say, okay, we can help you actually, and go back and take more samples and send more samples to Tobago. And that was very good. The other impact, I think, was just really bring this issue of the Atlantic migration route and all the deaths and disappearances and all these boats that were washing ashore on the other side of the Atlantic to the international stage. I think a bit more, give more attention to this route, because we talk about the Mediterranean a lot, but the Atlantic is so deadly, and there's so little information about it. And then I think this year, for example, we saw again another case happen in Brazil, a boat from Mauritania that drifted across the Atlantic and was found in Brazil, and authorities had seen our investigation, had seen our story, and used a lot of the lessons learned or the techniques we used, and are now investigating this case in Brazil and have this as a reference. So that is, I think, really beneficial, just to have more information about, the fact that these boats are washing ashore on the other side of the Atlantic, and people know about it, and families know about it, and authorities know about it.
We definitely noticed that every time after we published, as Renata said, it was not the first time that happened, but it was really, there was not a single investigation like this before. So after that, every boat that appeared across the Atlantic, we would see a spike in our
I think,
like people were reaching out to us again and asking more.
I think we proved that it's cases like this can be investigated, and people can be found, and victims can be identified, because a lot of times we see cases like this and they lead to nothing. There's no conclusion. No one gets identified. Families are never informed. We kind of proved it can be done if people put in the resources and the time to do it.
Which brings up the question of, why do you think this was so ignored? Why did nobody pay attention to this? We hear about, boats in the Mediterranean, certainly, but nobody had written about this. Why?
I mean, to be fair, there had been some stories on the Atlantic route. I'm not saying no one had written about it, but I think few had investigated this thoroughly and found the families and showed the link and also showed the scope of the problem. We identified just into 2021, I don't remember now if it's 6 or 7 boats that drifted from West Africa to the Caribbean that were trying to get to Spain. So it really is a big issue. And this is not counting all the other boats that disappear.
Which are
But
the,
I think
the majority.
I think that, I mean, the lack of interest in solving cases of dead migrants or missing migrants and finding their families and identifying them is a problem across the world. But I think in this route that's so disconnected, first of all, I think that the fact that these are usually Black people we're talking about from Africa, from West Africa, Black men. If they were white, I think the reaction and the interest in finding out what had happened would have been much.
Very different.
Yes, I think the reaction would have been different. But I think also, to be fair, people in the Caribbean and in Latin America didn't have this context of the migration. They didn't know the migration that was happening from West Africa to Spain. And so I think we're connecting the dots and kind of giving that context, giving that background and information.
And we saw that very clearly a few months ago when this boat was found in Brazil. And, you know, we're both Brazilians, so we were following the local news in Brazil. And the first kind of news when it came out, assumptions were absolutely wrong. And we, of course,
people were saying, "Oh, these are Haitians."
These are Haitians,
And
because
And you knew that was not.
because they thought it would be from somewhere nearby, not across the Atlantic. When we saw the boat, we immediately knew that was a Mauritanian boat. But, you know, people that are covering
that was not the
news
first.
and local authorities, they would not think that this. And then that's where we also saw the actually our story was used as evidence that, oh, this could be a Mauritanian boat. And then, you know, of course we know that's the case, but
Turned out to be
it would not be known if and like in other cases as well. Yeah.
So I'm guessing at the start of this investigation, you had no idea how hard it would be and no idea that it would take 2 years. Is that right? And were there points when you just wanted to give up altogether?
For sure. I mean, I think I've said this already. In the beginning, I thought I was just going to report on what police found out. I was just waiting for authorities to, you know, figure out what had happened, and I would report on whatever conclusion they reached. And then we realized that they weren't moving forward, that the investigation had stalled, that, you know, it was just going to end there. And we decided, and other organizations that could have helped or might have done more weren't also doing anything or not enough. So we decided to take it on ourselves. And we didn't realize we would get as far as we did. There were also things that happened throughout our reporting, both related and unrelated to the story. For example, there was the war in Ukraine that we had to, you know, pause and report on that as well. And so it took much longer than we had anticipated, but I think in the end, the time also helped us get to the bottom of it.
A lot of the steps, like the DNA test that we spoke earlier, those are steps that were very important, but they took months and many months that we had to wait for something that we couldn't do much in between. So it was very difficult to,
And there are moments where you progress very rapidly in the investigation and moments where it stalls again and you think you're never going to get the story, or that, you know, your sources disappear or go quiet, and then you kind of want to give up, and then they come back, and then there's more information, and all of a sudden it speeds up again, and you pick up the pace and more information. But it's really a roller coaster of reporting, of emotions, of findings, of, you know, everything. So yeah, it was really
well, to get back to the question I brought up at the beginning on how I did this without killing my spouse, were there times where you disagreed, and who was the good cop here, and how did that work?
No,
I'm the good cop. He's the bad.
I'm the good cop. I'm the
So you're both the good cop, okay?
No,
No, yeah, I mean, of course, we disagreed on many times, but I think we have very complementary skills, and we use that along the way to make this happen. But it was, difficult, especially as we said many times already in Mauritania. There were times that we had to decide, one of us go, the other one sits in the car, and I'll hide the cameras and pretend I'm gonna go buy
tourist, yeah.
fish, no, like a fish buyer, to enter places where I was not allowed to as a journalist. So it was yeah, and it was challenging, to make those decisions.
No, or how to approach certain authorities. I
Yeah.
have one way of approaching, he has another way of approaching them. And,
Yeah,
I think that's, where we kind of disagree. But in general, I think we also really helped each other through these 2 years, because it was really challenging. It was challenging just in terms of the reporting, in terms of, emotionally speaking. Carrying a story like that for 2 years is really difficult, and especially when you don't know how it's going to turn out. And
Yeah.
because of all the implications, the families and the answers they're seeking and the answers you're seeking. So I think in the end, it worked out that we actually,
yeah. I think it would be even
it was
more
a
challenging.
24-hour, 7 days a week investigation. So
Yeah, it would be even more
we were
challenging.
understanding.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, well, let me, I know the session is being recorded, but if there is anyone live who would like to ask questions or put anything in the chat, let me just open it up for a minute. Okay, it doesn't look like anyone is sending in questions. They might as people watch the recording, but I'll leave you two to deal with that. So, well, let's tie it up there. Thank you both so much. Oh, well, we do have a question. Did the AP empower you to make those kinds of decisions in the course of the reporting? For example, to at times present yourself not as a journalist?
No.
We never didn't.
You never did that. Yeah.
Yeah, we never did that. We always presented ourselves as a journalist. What I meant to say before when we approached it in two parts is that we didn't go on the record immediately, in the sense of, this is not an interview. We're talking to you, we're journalists, this is what we found, but don't feel like you have to be part of the story, or this is an interview. We'll come back another day to have that discussion.
Yeah.
But have
we
it
always
actually
explained.
recorded.
Yeah, and I think what I was saying was, more in Mauritania, there were places that they didn't want us to enter, and then I didn't go with the cameras, and I didn't in those places. I didn't
maybe
present
the fish buyer.
the fish buyer.
Trying to get into
Yeah,
reports.
that was
Discreetly not talking.
that was a different situation. It was not that I was not presenting myself as a journalist. It was just that they don't allow they basically don't allow journalists because of a different problem. There is a lot of illegal fishing in Mauritania, so the port is highly controlled.
That makes sense.
But I wanted to go into the port to, just because that's where they left. So I entered several times, not as a journalist, but that was not the case of, it was more of I really felt like we needed to go in. And that was the way our fixer managed to get us in. but like every time, as Renata said, every time we were talking to people,
asked, we have
right, you would identify yourselves as journalists.
or when we were caught, every time we presented
you would say. Another question, how much time did you spend reporting in Mauritania and in the Caribbean?
Mauritania was 3 weeks.
1 month in Mauritania.
1 month.
1 month in Mauritania.
Because it's such a huge country.
Because we travel across the entire country, basically.
Yeah, we went from Nouadhibou, which is the north west, all the way to the southeast on the border with Mali.
And then a couple of weeks in Spain, of course, in France and Tobago and Trinidad and Tobago.
I think it was like 10 days in Trinidad and Tobago.
2 weeks, around
10 days, 2 weeks, yeah.
Next question. What role did your fixer or fixers have in your investigation?
In Mauritania is where
Yeah.
we had a fixer.
We only use a fixer in Mauritania. And usually I can say that I work a lot with fixers because I work, in many different countries where you need to work with fixers, and I have some of them became very, very close friends, and some of my best friends I met as fixers, but in Mauritania it was a traumatic experience.
They weren't as helpful as we had hoped they would be.
Yeah.
It was more about logistics and
Yeah.
driving around and getting places rather than the investigation.
Rather than
itself.
journalistic,
Yeah.
like they're not the kind of fixers that.
It was more logistics.
Yeah, they were not basically used to working with journalists, so it was more about.
Didn't you require them for the language? I mean,
Yeah.
Yes and no, because
that's what we're saying.
there's a lot of different languages that.
And the experience that we had in Mauritania was so bad with the fixer that we.
One driver abandoned us in the middle of the report.
Yeah, so we ended up.
He didn't work on anything that had to do with migration. And then for the language, the fixer was Hassaniya speaking, Arabic speaking, but the communities we were visiting spoke Fulani and Sonanke, and so we had other local interpreters working with us.
We ended up locating basically what we realized was better in this particular situation was we located in every city that we needed locals that could work with us just as translators, because from French to whatever was the local language, and they were. So that was much better than the fixer, but that was a very specific case in Mauritania because, as I said, this is not usually the case with fixers.
That we usually rely on them.
Usually
they play a much more important role.
Yeah, this specific case was very difficult.
Too. Okay, well, it looks like we don't have any more questions on the chat. So why don't we wrap it up here? Thank you both very much for joining us. And thank you both also for the amazing amount of persistence that you put into this investigation. I mean, some of the methods you used were really difficult and took a lot of creativity. So a huge thank you for that. And thank you all for being here. Okay, bye all.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.